Hello there, and welcome to the second of what will be 4 videos on our online Lenten series on the history and lives of the saints, which we were going to have in person at the British Bankers Club, but are trying to do online through a series of short videos, which we'll post on our website. I'm going to go through some different aspects and elements of the lives of the saints. In video 1, I talked about a history and overview of how saints are remembered and commemorated within Anglicanism. And in this week's installment, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the controversies, even some of the politics that go into canonization. Because even though commemorating the lives of important and famous people is something many Christians share, they don't always agree on who these people are, how they should be remembered, or even if they're worthy of being remembered. So that's going to be the topic of this week's video. Keep in mind also, we are doing this in conjunction with the online Ministry of Forward Movement Publications in the Episcopal Church, Lent Madness. You can go there at lentmadness.org, where they have a bracket-style system where you get to read up on the lives of the saints and then decide who moves through each round until one is finally crowned with a golden halo. So I'm going to talk about 3 different political, controversial aspects of sainthood in this second video. One from 3 different eras of the church. Start with the apostolic era. We'll talk about Junia. Junia is actually one of the folks in the bracket this year for Lent Madness. She's one of the folks you can read up on and vote and see whether to go through. And there's been a significant amount of controversy around this person that is only mentioned in one verse of the Bible, Romans 16, verse 7, Paul's letter to the Romans. He mentions to the Romans, greet Andronicus and Junia, my compatriots, my relatives. They are prominent among the apostles and were in Christ before me. So we learn 2 important things. Junia is called an apostle. Not only is Junia called an apostle, she was a Christian before Paul was. She preceded me in Christ. Okay, so far so good. Paul does this in a lot of different letters. He sends extensive greetings to people. But what we notice with Junia is that in later manuscripts, very early on, they start adding an S to this name, making it Junias. That's a male name in Greek. So in essence, Junia, in the oldest manuscripts, is a woman. She was called an apostle, and she was a Christian before Paul was, earlier than Paul became a Christian. We see quite soon, actually, later manuscripts start changing this name to a male name. And throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, Junias was a male and an apostle, in part because leadership in the Christian community begins to be restricted solely to men, as men are consecrated as bishops, men can become priests. The roles of women in leadership are restricted after the early period and become to be exclusively focused around men. To the point that to this day, in the Roman Catholic Church, there are many Roman Catholic scholars who nonetheless still insist on the male version of the name Junias being the correct version, that this was in fact a correction of earlier manuscripts. So we see in this first example, just in the figure of Junia herself, the way in which later traditions and later understandings of the church can go into how people get remembered and who they get remembered as a saint. But it's pretty clear that the earliest manuscripts, and in biblical scholarship, earlier is usually considered to be better and more accurate. It's pretty straightforward. Junia was a woman. She was a Christian before Paul was, and she was considered an apostle. And you can read on more about Junia in the Lent Madness brochure that goes along with the competition this year. So that's one example of how controversy in politics and politicization can sometimes impact how we remember saints. Example number 2 within the Anglican tradition. Charles I, King of England from 1625 to 1649, died an untimely death in 1649. Not to get too deep into it, but England had a civil war in the 1640s. And there were political as well as religious overtones to this civil war, where folks whom we call Puritans, the folks who founded this Massachusetts Bay Colony, were in the ascendancy in the Parliament. They were anti-king, they were anti-bishop, they were anti-Book of Common Prayer. They wanted a more thoroughgoing reformation of the church in England, whereas the king and many of the leaders in the Church of England did not and wanted to keep the system and structure in place. So the English Civil War has religious as well as political overtones. Too long, don't need to go into it. Charles loses, and Charles is condemned to death and beheaded in public in 1649. Horrifying event. Many ways made a lot of people realize things had gone too far, and in part eventually leads to a restoration of the monarchy, where years later his son Charles II becomes king. So Charles I is remembered and commemorated as a martyr. As a martyr because he died for what he believed in, and also because he was a strong supporter of bishops and of the Book of Common Prayer and of the Church of England as it was structured. Sure enough, after the king is executed and the more radical elements take over, the episcopacy is banned and the Book of Common Prayer is banned for 13 years until Charles II becomes king in 1662. So far so good, right? Charles was a martyr, died for what he believed in, died defending the episcopacy and the Book of Common Prayer. Well, Charles is not commemorated in the Episcopal Church. He's commemorated on many, many other calendars of other Anglican churches throughout the world, but not in the United States. Officially, he's not in the list of commemorations in the Book of Common Prayer. He's regularly brought up for remembrance and commemoration to be added to the calendar, and every single time Charles goes down. Why is that? What are some of the overtones that might be involved in this? Well, for one thing, those people who executed Charles were the people who founded this country. The Puritans, who were concerned about things like kings and bishops, were the ones who founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the ones who had enormous influence in shaping the political and religious culture of this time. To give a really specific example, in New Haven, Connecticut, the three main roads of the town are Dixwell, Whaley, and Gough avenues. Those are three of the judges who signed the warrant for Charles I's execution. So the godly Puritans in New Haven thought so highly of the magistrates who condemned the king to death, they named the three main streets of the town that they were laying out after them. And several of those magistrates fled to England when the monarchy was restored and lived out their lives here in the colonies. So Charles I, in one sense, there's been a reluctance in the Episcopal Church, and because of who we are as Americans, with an ingrained reluctance to accept the authority and power of kings, we, as Americans, don't particularly have overall, that kind of notion and respect for kings, the way in which, in a European context, kings were also imbued with a kind of sacred authority as well as they were anointed. The way priests and the way bishops were anointed at their ordinations, kings were anointed at their consecrations. So in one part, because the people who founded this company were kind of anti all those things Charles was trying to defend, and how that in many ways is seeped into the broader culture. And secondly, just the way in which, in the American context, we kind of view kings anyways. And thirdly, and this came up often at the last couple of times that they tried to add Charles I to the calendar, that as the Episcopal Church has been trying to update its liturgical calendar, it's been trying to kind of broaden the voices and broaden the diversity among those folks that we commemorate. And many folks, I was there for the last time Charles I was debated for inclusion in the calendar, and many folks stated openly that what the one thing they didn't think the Episcopal Church's liturgical calendar needed was yet another noble, rich, kingly, white male dude. And was this the kind of diversity we thought we were? I'm not necessarily saying one way or the other. I'm actually, frankly, kind of agnostic on whether Charles should be commemorated or not. But nonetheless, I think it's interesting to look at the way in which the Episcopal Church is an outlier and how we don't commemorate Charles I when many other provinces of the Anglican Communion do, for reasons that have nothing to do with Charles himself, but with us instead. Okay, third and last example. This one is much, much more recent. John Henry Newman is canonized as a saint by the Roman Catholic Church in 2019. John Henry Newman lived the first half of his life as an Anglican. He was a professor at Oxford. He was a priest of the Church of England. led a renewal movement within the Church of England that became very influential. But in 1845, John Henry Newman becomes a Roman Catholic, is later ordained a priest, later becomes a cardinal, becomes one of the most influential theological voices in the second half of the 19th century. Newman eventually is canonized. Newman has a broad influence over the Roman Catholic Church. Many folks may have heard of Newman through Newman Centers, which are essentially campus chaplaincy ministries. Many colleges, universities have a Newman Center, which is often the outreach to students and a college chaplaincy, given that Newman spent most of his life in higher education. So John Henry Newman, remember, he was born an Anglican, spent the first half of his life as one of the most influential and popular Anglicans before becoming a Roman Catholic and a cardinal. Okay, Newman is canonized in 2019. Very big deal. He's canonized in England. The Pope comes. Prince Charles attends. It's a rather significant ceremony. Two things about Newman. One is that the date chosen for his commemoration is not the usual date that's picked. Normally, when someone is canonized, the date at which they're remembered is either the date of their birth or the date of their death. For Newman, they picked the day of his conversion from Anglicanism to Catholicism. Not his birthday or his death day, but very unusually, they picked the day that he was received into the Roman Catholic Church. That's one interesting bit. Second interesting bit is that when Newman was being canonized, as the Pope was presiding over the ceremony, they were very important to point out in the news article, because I read it at the time, the news article that accompanied it, that the Pope was wearing the stole worn by Leo XIII, Pope Leo XIII. Why is that important? Pope Leo XIII was the Pope who, in the 1890s, issued a papal encyclical that formally condemned the ministerial orders of the Church of England as completely null and utterly void, the language from the proclamation. That the ministerial orders of the Church of England and of the Episcopal Church are absolutely null and void, are not valid, and are not occasions of grace. So frankly, the canonization of Newman was a way to stick it to the Church of England and to stick it to Anglicans. There's no other way to put it, by Roman Catholics. By choosing not the date of his birth and not the date of his death. By choosing the date of his conversion from Anglicanism to Catholicism. And by specifically noting the Pope was wearing a stole of Leo XIII, shows that they used this occasion for the canonization of John Henry Newman as a way to make an ecclesiological and theological point about Anglicanism. It was a way to stick it to the Anglicans. Okay, just three quick overviews of three saints in this second video. As we remember the lives of saints, we often have to keep in mind as we think winding this video down, it's just what I said more previously. Often when it comes to the lives of the saints, we can find out as much about ourselves, who we are, where we are in our particular time and place, as those whom we remember and those whom we commemorate. So that's video number 2. Stay tuned. There'll be occasional videos. Remember to go to lentmadness.org to follow along, and stay tuned. Another week or so, I'll post another video. Take care. Be safe. See you soon.